I bought my parents a $425,000 seaside mansion, then I found my sister's family living there, and her husband ordered me out of my own gift. I gifted my parents their dream coastal home for their golden anniversary, a place of peace and beauty. But when I visited, I found my mother in tears and my father trembling, as my brother-in-law pointed to the door, brazenly declaring, "This is my house. Now leave." It was the sight of Garrett Dalton, my brother-in-law, gesturing dismissively towards the exit of a home legally owned by me, that solidified my decision. This charade had gone on long enough. Not when I first noticed the unfamiliar pickup truck in the spot usually occupied by my parents' sedan. Not when I saw moving boxes haphazardly piled on my porch, a porch belonging to a house whose deed bore my name in clear, unambiguous print. Not even when I stepped inside to find my mother, Eleanor, weeping silently into a dish towel at the kitchen table, while my father, Arthur, stood a few feet away, visibly shaking, his glasses perched precariously at the end of his nose. No, the breaking point arrived when Garrett Dalton, a substantial man whose confidence felt entirely borrowed, turned from the living room window. He pointed towards the front door, which I had just entered, and with the unshakable certainty of someone utterly unacquainted with genuine challenge, stated, "This is my residence now. Get out." Through the window behind him, the vast expanse of the ocean shimmered, an $11 million stretch of coastline. I had chosen this exact property because my parents, after 5 decades of rising before dawn, deserved to awaken to something truly magnificent. I quietly closed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and met Garrett's gaze. "Fascinating," I replied, a calm I didn't entirely feel in my voice. "Could you clarify for me, one more time, whose house this supposedly is?" But to truly understand that moment, we need to rewind. This story doesn't begin with Garrett, nor solely with my sister Valerie. It starts 4 years prior, on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in the parking garage of a tech campus in San Jose, calling my mother to wish her a happy birthday. She cried for a full 7 minutes before finally explaining why. "My name is Elias Vance. I'm 38 years old. I founded a software analytics company with 2 partners in a modest 2-bedroom apartment back in 2013. 9 years later, that company was acquired for a figure that briefly put my name in certain trade publications and irrevocably reshaped my life in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I share this not to flaunt wealth, but because it provides crucial context for everything that follows. Money, I've learned, doesn't complicate family dynamics, it illuminates them. It strips away every pretense, revealing the underlying tensions and inclinations that were always present. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor Vance, are the sort of people who will never fully grasp the intricacies of my profession, yet they raised me in a way that made that entirely beside the point. My father spent 31 years as a machinist at a plant in coastal Virginia, a plant that ultimately closed its doors in 2009. For those same decades, my mother juggled part-time bookkeeping with the full-time management of a household that operated on meticulous budgeting and the unique resourcefulness of people adept at making ends meet. They've lived for 41 years in a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that saw its prime in the 1980s. Never once did they complain about it in my presence, for complaining was a word absent from the vocabulary they used around their children. What they also never voiced, to their children or otherwise, was that the house had a perpetually leaking roof they'd patched twice but couldn't afford to properly repair. My father's knees had deteriorated to the point where the stairs posed a genuine daily struggle. And my mother had ceased mentioning the arthritis in her hands, understanding that voicing it had never changed anything, and she preferred to conserve her energy for things she could influence. I only discovered all this on my mother's 68th birthday, in that parking garage, after her 7-minute cry, when she apologized for her tears and then simply said it had been a hard winter. I sat in my car for a long time after our call ended. Then, I dialed my real estate attorney. Valerie Vance Dalton, my sister, is 4 years my senior. I want to be precise here, as precision is essential to fairly recount this particular story. She wasn't always the person she became. There was a version of my sister, in our childhood, who would share her Halloween candy without being asked. The sister who sat with me through a 2-hour thunderstorm when I was 7, because I was scared, and she had silently decided not to be anywhere else. That version of her existed. I want to state that clearly. Yet, somewhere within the decade of her marriage to Garrett Dalton, that version of my sister became increasingly elusive. Garrett was an insurance salesman, or at least he had been, up until 8 months before the day he stood in my doorway telling me to leave. He possessed a way of inhabiting a space that I can only describe as presumptuous. He moved through rooms as if they had been anticipating his arrival, as if his presence was the central event and everything before it merely an overture. He would launch into lengthy anecdotes that were, in essence, extended showcases of his own competence. And he had a habit of laughing at his own jokes before he'd even finished telling them, a peculiar trait I find difficult to view charitably. He and Valerie had 2 sons, aged 9 and 11, who were, by all accounts, good kids, grappling with the specific challenge of being raised by parents whose relationship with money was transactional and whose sense of accountability was virtually non-existent. I didn't dislike Garrett because he was loud, or because he laughed excessively, or because he habitually referred to my parents' home as the old place, with a tone that managed to be both patronizing and dismissive. I disliked Garrett because, over 11 years, I had observed the corrosive effect he had on my sister. The woman who once sat with me through thunderstorms now laughed at things that weren't funny, fell silent when she ought to have spoken, and had gradually, almost imperceptibly, outsourced her judgment to a man whose judgment was not worth the outsourcing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My parents didn't find the house in April. I found it, with the help of a buyer's agent named Sophia Chen. Sophia had 2 decades of experience in coastal Virginia real estate and instinctively understood what I was searching for without requiring me to articulate it twice. 3 bedrooms on the ground floor, crucial for my father's mobility. A kitchen with a south-facing window, ensuring my mother would have morning light while she cooked. A back porch overlooking the water, spacious enough for my father's rocking chairs and tranquil enough for them both to sit in quiet companionship, without the need to fill the silence. The price was $425,000, and it was worth every single penny. I placed the deeds solely in my name, with a formal occupancy agreement crafted by my attorney, Marcus Thorne of Thorne Property Law. Marcus, with 16 years in residential real estate, operating out of a glass-fronted building on Granby Street, structured the agreement to establish my parents as permanent occupants with specified rights and protections. Marcus had suggested this arrangement. It protects them, he had told me, and it safeguards the asset from any third-party claims. At the time, I thought he was merely being procedurally diligent. He was, in fact, being prophetically thorough. Before my parents moved in, I also had a comprehensive home security system installed. It was a ring system, featuring 8 cameras covering every exterior angle and all primary interior access points, complete with cloud backup and a mobile app accessible from anywhere. The installer, a capable young man named Kai, who finished 2 hours ahead of schedule, showed me how to review the access logs. I thanked him and mentally filed away the information, never truly believing I would actually need those logs. My parents moved in on a Saturday in June. I stayed for the weekend. We ate takeout crab from paper boxes on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon over the water. My mother cried then, but this time, they were tears of pure joy. My father put his arm around her, gazing at the ocean with the expression of a man confronting something he had never truly permitted himself to desire. It was the best 2 days of my entire year. I drove back to Virginia Beach on Monday morning, my flight to San Jose scheduled for noon. The first hint of trouble arrived 2 weeks later, and I dismissed it as nothing. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon, which was typical, but the call was shorter than usual, which was not. She said everything was fine. She mentioned that the garden beds I had installed along the south wall were thriving. She casually added that Valerie and Garrett had visited with the boys on Saturday. I said that was lovely. She agreed. There was a subtle quality to her voice, something I couldn't quite identify. A slight constraint, as if she were speaking from a smaller space than usual, choosing her words with more deliberation than a conversation about garden beds should necessitate. I told myself she was just tired. 3 weeks after that, I called my father on a Thursday evening and received no answer. He almost always answered. His phone was invariably in his shirt pocket from 7 in the morning until 9 at night, with the unwavering consistency of a man who viewed missed calls as a breach of etiquette. I texted him. No response for 3 hours, which had genuinely never happened before. When he finally called back at 9:47 p.m., he explained he'd been outside. His voice held the right words, but in a slightly scrambled order, the way speech sounds when someone is multitasking while talking. I told myself he was simply adjusting to the new routine. The third sign I completely missed until I reviewed the security footage later. On a Wednesday in mid-August, Garrett's truck appeared in the driveway at 11:15 a.m. He and Valerie went inside. The front door camera logged their entry using the access code. The interior cameras, which I hadn't reviewed, because I had installed the system for my parents' safety, not as a monitoring tool, showed them moving through the house for nearly 3 hours. The camera in the hallway captured Garrett standing in the doorway of the guest room for a prolonged period, arms crossed, slowly turning. He moved like someone assessing a space for a purpose entirely different from its current use. At 2:43 p.m., they departed. I saw none of this until much later. What I did notice, during a Sunday call in early September, was that my mother's crystal wine glasses were on the wrong shelf. I knew this because I was the one who had unpacked those glasses, carefully placing them on the upper left shelf where they'd resided for 30 years in their old home. I thought continuity would matter. My mother then mentioned, almost as an aside, that Valerie had reorganized the kitchen a little during her visit. She said it in a tone that was cautiously precise in a way that kitchen organization should never demand. "Mom," I asked, "is everything all right?" She replied, "Of course, dear." I booked my flight for the following weekend. I landed at Norfolk International on a Friday evening and drove the 40 minutes to the coast in a rental car, windows down. September on the Virginia coast possesses a unique quality of air I've never found anywhere else. I stopped at a grocery store, buying my father's preferred instant coffee, my mother's favorite English breakfast tea, and a box of the shortbread cookies she always pretended not to eat, yet consumed every time. As I turned onto the coastal road at 6:22 p.m., Garrett's truck was in the driveway. Beside it, another unfamiliar vehicle, a rented cargo van, the kind with a sliding side door, parked halfway on the lawn. I paused in the car for a moment, then got out. The front door was unlocked. This was unusual. My parents locked their door at 5 o'clock with the meticulousness of people raised to believe that an unlocked door was an invitation to trouble. I walked in and instantly understood, from the profound quality of the silence and the arrangement of objects, that I had stepped into the middle of something significant. The hallway table had been shoved against the wall. Cardboard boxes, flaps agape, partially filled, were stacked along the entry. Moving boxes, not guest luggage. And beside them, a roll of packing tape on the floor. I heard my mother before I saw her. Not words, but the distinct sound of someone crying with the specific restraint of a person who has been weeping for a while and has grown self-conscious about it. I followed the sound to the kitchen. She was at the table, a dish towel pressed to her face. She was wearing her good blouse, the blue one she reserved for special occasions, which made no sense until later. She had dressed up because today was meant to be a celebration of some kind, a family visit, and she had dressed accordingly. Then, things had gone awry, and she was still in her good blouse. My father stood by the kitchen doorway, his glasses still slid down his nose, a common occurrence when his hands were shaking too violently to manage the small motor task of pushing them up. They were shaking. He was staring at Garrett. Garrett stood in the center of the kitchen, arms crossed. And behind him, leaning in the archway between the kitchen and the living room, was Valerie. She held a wine glass in her hand. My mother's crystal. My mother's crystal. I looked at my father. He looked at me. Something wordless, yet more profound than silence, passed between us. I placed the grocery bag on the counter. Elias? Valerie pushed off from the archway with the particular energy of someone poised to perform a specific scene. Good. We should all talk. What's going on? I asked. Garrett uncrossed his arms. He had a way of expanding his presence when he sensed an audience. And he had certainly sensed one. What's happening is your parents are rattling around in a 4-bedroom house with a guest cottage and too many stairs. We're family. It makes perfect sense for us to be here to assist. Those are moving boxes, I stated. Transition boxes, Valerie corrected. Mom and Dad would be so much more comfortable in the guest cottage, more manageable. And we need the space. The boys need rooms. Garrett needs a home office. This is my house, I said. Garrett smiled. That smile, the one that encapsulated an entire worldview. It's your parents' home, he countered. And your parents are being very stubborn about what's practical. We're just trying to help them understand the situation. That was when I noticed my mother's wrist. She had lowered the dish towel, her hand resting on the table. On her right wrist, just above the joint, there was a shadowed bruise. The specific yellow-purple hue of a bruise 3 or 4 days old. The shape and size of fingers. The room seemed to reconfigure itself around that bruise. Everything that had been background now surged into the foreground, my father's tremor, my mother in her good blouse, weeping, the moving boxes, the cargo van outside. Who are you calling? Garrett's voice was sharp, sudden. I hadn't realized I'd pulled out my phone. The police, I said. His face subtly shifted. Not dramatically, Garrett was adept enough at maintaining his composure to keep the change minimal, but it was there. For what? He asked, with a laugh, the kind designed to imply absurdity and make you feel foolish for not recognizing it. Trespassing, I declared. Elder intimidation. I met his gaze. And whatever else they decide after they see Mom's wrist. Valerie's wine glass struck the counter with such force I was surprised it didn't shatter. We're family, Elias. No, I replied, looking at her for a long moment. My sister, who had once sat with me through thunderstorms, now a stranger. Arthur and Eleanor are family. You're an intruder using our last name. I dialed the number. Detective Miller arrived in 12 minutes with his partner, Officer Ramirez. 7 and 14 years, respectively, with the Coastal Precinct. I want to be precise about this because what transpired next was exact, and precision demands accurate details. Garrett underwent a remarkable transformation between the moment I ended the call and the officer's knock. The presumption drained from his posture. His voice dropped to the register of a man wrongly accused, patient and sorrowful, wounded by misunderstanding. His shoulders softened. He had, I observed, done this before. This was a finely rehearsed performance. Valerie cried beautifully. She explained to Officer Ramirez that she was merely attempting to assist her aging parents with a responsible transition, that her brother had never truly grasped family dynamics, and that she was being unfairly villainized for her efforts to help. Detective Miller, a compact man with reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket and the distinct quality of attention cultivated from years of listening to conflicting accounts of the same events, surveyed the room without speaking. He noted the boxes, the van outside, my mother's wrist. Then he requested identification and documentation. I handed him 3 items, the copy of the deed, solely my name printed in the clean, legal typography of an official property record. No one else's. The occupancy agreement Marcus Thorne had prepared, explicitly establishing my parents as protected occupants and specifying, in clear legal language, that no third party held rights of access or occupancy without the owner's written consent. That owner was me. No one had my written consent. And finally, the security system access log, pulled from the Ring app on my phone, which showed that the access code had been changed 2 days prior. Not by me, not by my parents. My father barely used the app, and my mother had asked me to manage it. The log indicated the change had been made by a device registered to a name I didn't recognize, but cross-referencing the timestamp confirmed Garrett's truck was in the driveway at that exact moment. Garrett stopped performing. He looked at the access log on my phone screen. He looked at me, and I witnessed the precise moment a man understands that the elaborate structure he has built stands on utterly nothing. Detective Miller turned to my father. My father had remained silent throughout this entire ordeal. He was a quiet man by nature, the kind of quiet that can be mistaken for passivity by those who fail to distinguish between a man choosing not to speak and a man who has nothing to say. His glasses were now properly positioned on his nose. He had straightened them when the officers arrived, a small, deliberate act of composure. "Sir," Detective Miller began, "can you tell me, in your own words, what has been happening here?" My father looked at Detective Miller, then at Garrett, then at Valerie, and finally found his voice. It emerged steady, as things sometimes do when the sheer willpower to speak has already completed the arduous work it demands. He grabbed Eleanor by the wrist. My father said. "For days ago, she was asking them to please not move her sewing things, and he took her wrist, and he told her to stop acting hysterical." A pause. "He told me to stop acting like a man unless I was prepared to be treated like one." The room fell absolutely silent. Valerie didn't cry this time. Garrett stared at the floor. Officer Ramirez was photographing my mother's wrist with her phone. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way that genuine institutional processes rarely are. It was thorough. And that is its own form of justice. The methodical, documented, step-by-step procedure of a system functioning exactly as it should. Detective Miller asked everyone to find a place to sit. Garrett, perhaps sensing that the ground had entirely dissolved beneath him, attempted one last performance. He spoke of a software executive wielding money as a weapon, of family being pressured into legal frameworks, about what kind of man buys his parents a house just to control them. I let him finish. "I bought this house," I stated calmly, "so they could wake up to the ocean after 50 years of waking up before sunrise just to survive." Then, the front door, which Officer Ramirez had left ajar, admitted someone none of us had called. Mrs. Albright, 71 years old, a retired librarian and our immediate neighbor to the north, a woman of the particular caliber that cultivates cardigan sweaters and gardening gloves and exudes an expression of serene determination, appeared in the doorway. "I believe I should speak to someone," she informed Detective Miller. He invited her in. Mrs. Albright proceeded to describe, with the precision of a woman who had spent 34 years cataloging information for a living, 3 separate incidents she had witnessed in the previous 9 days. Garrett shouting from the porch on a Tuesday, loud enough to be heard from her garden 20 meters away. My father, whom she knew by name, they had conversed over the fence several times about the respective merits of coastal gardening, locked outside the front door for 20 minutes on a Thursday, knocking, while voices continued inside. And a piece of porch furniture that had been inexplicably moved, which she had initially dismissed but then reconsidered. "I nearly called before," she told the officers. "I should have." Valerie covered her face with both hands, not weeping, but simply having nowhere else to put her expression. Detective Miller turned to Garrett and Valerie. He spoke quietly. Precisely. He informed them that, given the allegations of physical intimidation, the documented unauthorized changes to the access code, and the corroborating witness testimony, they would need to collect their essential belongings and vacate the property immediately. Officers would remain present to ensure an orderly process. Garrett's voice cracked for the first time. You're removing a family from a house over. You are being directed to vacate a property where you have no legal right of occupancy, following credible allegations of threats and physical intimidation against the documented residents, Officer Miller stated. He said it the way people articulate simple truths that require no emphasis. You're welcome to consult an attorney if you believe this action is improper. That is your right. In the meantime, please gather what you need. Garrett stood motionless for a moment. Then, he went to pack. They packed while Detective Miller and Officer Ramirez remained in the house, and what the packing revealed was its own form of documentation. Valerie's dresses, 4 of them, a week's worth at minimum, were hanging in my mother's closet. Garrett's shaving kit and toiletries were arranged beside my father's sink in the master bathroom, not in the guest bathroom, not in the hallway, but beside my father's sink, as if the takeover was already complete and they were merely waiting for the paperwork to catch up. My father's fishing rods, he had 4, acquired one at a time over 30 years, each associated with a specific body of water and a particular memory, had been bundled into a trash bag. Not their cases. A trash bag. My mother's quilts, she made quilts, had been making them for 40 years, and had given one to each of us when we left home, were stacked in bins labeled "Donate" in black marker. Donate. My mother's quilts in donation bins, in her own house. My mother saw the bins. She didn't utter a sound. She walked over, picked up the top quilt, a double wedding ring pattern in blue and cream that she had made the year my parents were married, pressed it against her chest briefly, and then carried it back to the bedroom. I followed her. She placed the quilt on the bed and smoothed it with both hands, the way she had smoothed things my entire life. She didn't look at me for a moment. How long? I asked. She smoothed the edge of the quilt. It started as a visit, she said. They came 3 weeks ago. Garrett said they'd help us get settled, and then they would just. She trailed off. I didn't want to worry you, Elias. You work so hard. I sat on the edge of the bed. I work hard so you don't have to worry about things like this, Mom, I said. That's the whole point of me working hard. She patted my hand. Then we returned to the living room. My father was in the study. I found him standing at the desk where someone had left a stack of printer paper on top of his Navy box. The wooden box he had kept for as long as I could remember. Containing his service medals, a collection of letters from his time in the Navy, and a folded flag from his brother Robert's military funeral. The papers were piled directly on top of the box's open lid, not beside it, but on it. As if whatever was inside was simply an inconvenience. My father lifted the stack of papers without looking at them and set them on the floor. He reached into the box, lifted the flag with both hands, the way you hold something that requires such care. He held it for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Garrett, who was moving through the hallway with a duffel bag. You will never speak to my wife again, my father said. Garrett stopped. Something in my father's voice carried the quality of an immovable force. Garrett attempted a smile, the old instinct, reaching for the tool that had always worked. Arthur, my father interjected, with the particular quiet strength of 40 years of grace that has finally decided to cease being mistaken for something else, is Mr. Vance to you? Garrett's smile faltered. My father looked at Valerie. I had never heard him speak to her this way, not with anger. My father was not, by nature, an angry man, but with exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been patient in the belief that patience would eventually be rewarded, and has just realized that some people lack the capacity to offer that reward. You will not call your mother asking for money, he stated. You will not send the boys to ask for gifts that you should be too ashamed to ask for yourself. He held Valerie's gaze. You brought this into our home. That is something you will have to live with. Valerie looked like a person hearing a language she didn't know existed. By 7:30 that evening, the cargo van was loaded. Garrett did not speak again. He moved with the efficiency of a man stripped of his performance, operating in its absence on pure mechanical function. He carried his boxes. He carried Valerie's dresses on their hangers, draped over his arm. He removed his toiletries from beside my father's sink and placed them in a bag without truly looking at what he was doing. I stood on the porch and watched the van doors close. Marcus Thorne, my attorney, had been on the phone with me twice that afternoon. When I called him at 3:15, he had promptly retrieved the property documents and the occupancy agreement, confirming that Detective Miller had everything he needed. He instructed me to contact him Monday morning to discuss any further legal action. Marcus had also, quietly, and with the professionalism I had come to rely on, mentioned that if my mother's wrist bruise was formally documented by a physician, which Officer Ramirez had already recommended, the evidentiary record for a formal elder abuse complaint would be strong. I watched the van pull out of the driveway. Valerie was in the passenger seat. She glanced back once. I did not wave. I went inside and found my parents in the kitchen. My father was making instant coffee, the brand I'd bought at the grocery store, which I'd left on the counter. My mother sat at the table with the blue and cream quilt across her lap, her fingers tracing the stitching. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a while. "I'm sorry," I finally said. "I should have had better protections in place." My mother looked up. She wore the expression she reserved for when she thought I was being unreasonable, an expression I had missed and was relieved to see again. "You bought us the ocean," she said. "That's not something to apologize for." I will share what I discovered later, because it was later when the full scope of things became clear. Garrett had lost his job in January after an internal audit revealed 18 months of falsified expense reports, a scheme that had netted him approximately $41,000, which his employer's lawyers were now attempting to recover through civil proceedings. Valerie's online home decor business, which she had exhaustively documented on social media for 3 years, turned out to be 70% staged photography and 30% products she had purchased with credit cards, now collectively maxed out at just under $30,000. The house they owned in New Jersey was 6 weeks from foreclosure. They hadn't come for a visit. They had come for a rescue. Specifically, the kind of rescue that involved occupying a space long enough, applying enough social and familial pressure, and making the existing residents sufficiently uncomfortable in their own home, that they would agree to a transfer, a signing over, or pressure me to restructure the property in a way that would solve the Daltons' problems at everyone else's expense. The plan, as best as I could reconstruct it, had been elegantly cynical. Establish occupancy, move my parents to the guest cottage under the guise of practicality, then leverage my parents' reluctance to cause family conflict into a gradual fait accompli. They expected my parents to be too gentle to fight back. They expected me to be too burdened by guilt over my wealth, or too conflict-averse, or too something, to push back. Garrett had simply grown impatient. He had grabbed my mother's wrist 3 days earlier than was operationally advisable, if operational is a word one can apply to a plan this shabby. He had grabbed my mother's wrist. He had walked into a house where his name appeared on nothing. He had told the man who owned it to leave. These were mistakes that compounded each other, as all plans built on the assumption that the people around you are smaller than they truly are, tend to do. 6 months later, a formal elder abuse complaint was filed the following Monday, based on Officer Ramirez's documentation and a medical assessment of my mother's wrist conducted by Dr. Anya Sharma at the Coastal Urgent Care Clinic, a family medicine physician with 12 years of experience. Dr. Sharma documented the bruising as consistent with forcible gripping, and her report became Exhibit A in a complaint that the county DA's office reviewed for potential misdemeanor elder intimidation charges. Garrett's attorney, a man named Mr. Henderson, who apparently was also handling the expense report litigation and therefore had a very full autumn schedule, negotiated a resolution that included a formal no-contact order covering both my parents, enforceable for 3 years. Garrett did not see the inside of a courtroom, which I have some strong feelings about, but my father said he didn't want the boys to see it. And my father's preference carries more weight than my feelings. Valerie has not called, not once in 6 months. I don't know if that's shame, strategy, or something else entirely. I have not called her. I think about the person she was at 7 years old, sitting with me through a thunderstorm. And I hold on to that person as distinct from who she became, because it seems important to remember that people can contain both. The New Jersey house went into foreclosure in November. I know this because I looked it up. I'm not proud of looking it up, but I did. My parents have settled into the house in the way of people who, for 50 years, never quite believed they deserved something beautiful, slowly learning that they do. My father has a rocking chair on the back porch and his fishing rods in the garage, properly stored this time in their cases. My mother has a garden bed along the south wall that is flourishing beyond her expectations. She made a new quilt. She started it the week after the Daltons left, the specific kind of project a person embarks on when they need to reclaim something, and finished it in 8 weeks, which for my mother, is remarkably fast. She hung it on the wall of the living room. It faces the ocean window. I was there for Thanksgiving. My father brewed coffee at 6 in the morning, and we sat on the porch in our coats in the cold, clear November air, watching the water. He looked like a man who had journeyed through something difficult and was now, carefully and genuinely, somewhere else. "Thank you, Elias," he said. "For what?" He pondered for a moment. "For knowing what we needed before we said it." I looked at the ocean. It looked back, as the ocean always does. Patient, indifferent, immensely ancient, utterly unconcerned with the small human dramas unfolding on its shores. "That's what you both always did for me," I replied. He nodded once. We finished our coffee. The sun rose over the water, just as it does every morning on that porch.